Hello, good evening, everyone. We want to welcome you to the city's first displacement response strategy feedback session. Before we get started, I'd like to invite our interpreters to welcome folks and explain how to get into the Spanish and Mandarin language interpretation rooms. Anna and Ivy, could you provide this translation, please?
Sí, muy buenas tardes. Esta tarde tendremos interpretación al español. En la parte inferior de su pantalla seleccione el icono con el idioma español. Muchas gracias.
大家晚上好，今晚的会议提供中文翻译。当您点击屏幕上出现的语言图标时，选择 Chinese， 以用中文收听今晚的会议。点击图标的时候，您还可以选择将原始音频静音。谢谢。
Great, thank you so much, Anna and Ivy. And again, welcome everyone. My name is Wayne.
Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Wen Cheng.
And I'm the Assistant Community Development Director with the City of Mountain View. I oversee the city's housing efforts, including affordable housing, policy and program development, and rent stabilization programs. And along with me tonight is Michaela Hellman-Tincher, the city's Housing and Neighborhood Services Manager, who manages our affordable housing programs. And of course, we have our amazing interpretation team who will be providing interpretation services for folks who need it. So thank you to the interpretation team. So tonight is the first in a series of public meetings seeking to get community input on the city's displacement response strategy. We know you're all very busy, so we really appreciate that you are here with us tonight. This is an important item for the city, and we know it's a very important item for the community as well. And our plan is to have about an hour and a half for this meeting with plenty of time for discussion. If the discussion is very robust and strong, we can certainly stay on for longer. And please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the displacement response website, and we'll provide that information at the end of this presentation as well. So we have two big goals for everyone tonight. What we wanted to do is really kind of set the stage for folks and give folks either a reminder or a background on the strategy. This item started a couple years ago or a few years ago before the COVID pandemic, and we wanted to provide that background and also the things that we were doing during the pandemic that were related to displacement response. We want to provide you some considerations that we are thinking about for next steps for developing the strategy. And very importantly, we want to hear your input, which will be very important for informing the next stage of developing the strategy. So those are our goals for today. The way we'll accomplish those goals is we have an agenda. So we'll start with going over some logistics. Then we'll go into the history of how we got to today, talk about what the future of the city's work in this area may look like, as well as some potential programs or policies we'd like to discuss with you, gather some initial input, and share information about future opportunities. We have some questions we've identified that we think are some key questions. We know there are many other questions and other items that you may have that are not on our current list. We won't be able to get through all of them tonight, but we can certainly start the process, and that's the intent of today's meeting. We will have plenty of time in other stakeholder meetings to discuss these questions in more detail, and we very much welcome you to contact us to schedule individual meetings as well, to spend more time with you or to really spend more discussion time to go over any particular area that you may have. So we're setting the stage, and we'll have plenty of time to discuss further. For folks who might have joined a few minutes after the start of this meeting, I just wanted to remind folks that we do have interpretation available in Spanish and Mandarin tonight. And to hear the interpretation, please click the globe icon on your screen, and I'll give some folks some time to do that. And if I could ask Anna and Ivy to provide this interpretation again as well, that would be great.
Wayne, actually, since they're in the interpretation rooms, they won't be able to do that. But I am getting feedback that the Spanish translation is working, and I will test the Mandarin right now.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Then we'll move on to the next slide. We wanted to just note that because this is an important topic for many folks, there may be a wide range of perspectives and views, and our goal really is to be able to hold a respectful civil space to facilitate this community conversation. So we will be asking for input both through the chat from the speakers and ask folks to treat each other with respect tonight. And we'll really be managing the meeting to ensure that this maintains a respectful and civil place. So we'll be asking folks to participate in two ways later this evening. And I just wanted to go over some of the instructions for how to participate. The first is via the chat. You can feel free to put your input in the chat box in there when we ask questions, and we will look at it during the meeting and we will keep a record of it as part of the feedback. And so your chat box may be in different parts of your screen. So if you sort of locate it, oftentimes or usually times it may be on the bottom of the bar. So that's your chat box. You can type into that. The second is through speaking. That's the second way you could provide comments or input. When we get to the speaking portion of the meeting, we will invite folks who would like to speak to press the raise hand button or *9 on their phone, and we will unmute folks to speak. I'll remind you of this when we get to these portions of the meeting. So we will try to get through and touch on all the questions or input provided today. If we're not able to get to everyone's input, then again, we will provide a summary of the future opportunities, upcoming meetings, opportunities to meet with you one-on-one, and also an email where you can send the input as well. So I think now,
before we go on, I'm hearing that some folks are having a little trouble hearing you. If you can get a little closer to your microphone.
sure, let me turn up my microphone setting. Please give me 1 second.
Michaela, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just do a quick test. Is this a little bit better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. If this works, let me know. But if it needs to be turned up a little bit more, do let me know. Okay, we can go to the next slide, I think. Great. So again, I had mentioned that this item started before the pandemic, and the issue of displacement response and tenant displacement started when the city was undergoing review of certain residential projects that had a redevelopment demolition component to those projects. In building the new units, existing units, particularly rent stabilized units, would need to be demolished. And so in 2019, there was discussion on this item. We had done some analysis, and since 2012, there had been about 1,000 rent stabilized units that were either demolished or part of redevelopment projects. And so that really raised the importance of this item for council, and this item was put on the council's high priority work plan items list in 2019. And we started to work on this strategy first by holding 2 study sessions, one in 2019 and one in 2020, to discuss the issues. And at the time, we did a couple of important things. We identified some principles to help guide our work. And we also identified 6 initial policy and program areas to focus on. And so I want to go over those very briefly right now. So the 5 key principles that we shared with council, and council unanimously supported these principles, are on the screen here. And I'll go over each one very quickly. But the first principle is that the strategy should have different parts to it, because displacement response is very complicated, and it affects different families and residences and tenants in different ways. So we have to look at different policies and programs. Hopefully they will work together to address the issue of displacement response. So this is mainly to say that we do need to look at a broader range of programs. It isn't just one policy or one program. And similarly, that this strategy should be broad-based. There may be situations where we can have policies or programs to prevent displacement. Folks don't have to lose their units, or they can find a way to stay in the unit. There may be some situations where it cannot be prevented. And in that situation, what we're trying to do is to reduce the impacts to the families who have to move from their homes. And so that's why this is called a displacement response strategy, is to prevent, but also to reduce the impacts. So there are those two components at least. We felt that this needed to be a very collaborative approach. The city would not necessarily be able to address all of the issues. We need partners in the community to work on this together, whether it's to come up with different policies to consider, or whether we are partnering with other housing agencies to find funding to acquire and preserve units, or to build more units. We can't do it alone. So the partnership is really important. And we have to look at all the different sectors, whether it's private sector or other government agencies, or maybe foundations or philanthropy. So we want to look at all the potential partners. There is a focus on tenants here in Mountain View. This was important at the time because in other cities, there were displacement issues with homeowners. In Mountain View, the tenant displacement issue, that was really sort of the focus on tenants, and not as much in the ownership side. So it's a focus on tenants, particularly in rent stabilized units. And the strategy should be unit and place based. What this means is that to the extent possible, we want to be able to, again, keep folks in the homes that they're in. But if that's not necessarily possible, we want to be able to find a way to keep the residents in Mountain View, somewhere in the city. And if that's not possible, somewhere close to Mountain View, because we know that you have connections here in Mountain View, and those are very important connections that you currently have. So that's why this is sort of called unit and place based. These are the 5 principles, and those are really guiding our work. And then very quickly, the 6 initial study areas is to look at a program to acquire or preserve existing housing units, particularly rent stabilized units. Another is looking at replacement requirements for redevelopment projects. So what that means is that in a planning project where there's a new proposal for new units, and there are units that exist that we need to get demolished, we're going to be looking at local replacement requirements. In a moment, we'll talk about some state provisions, but we're talking about one in Mountain View, something that the city would do. We looked at modifying our tenant relocation assistance ordinance. We wanted to evaluate what we called a landlord rental set-aside program, which is to potentially work with landlords who might have vacant units that could potentially be held aside to either permanently or temporarily give displaced residents a place in Mountain View to live. We are looking at a tenant selection preference for displaced residents. And what that means is that, is there an opportunity for displaced residents or tenants to be able to have priority for affordable housing if they are displaced? So that's something that we have looked at, and we're going to look at again. And there may be other things that we need to do in terms of creating new policies or ordinances or laws in Mountain View to make all these things work. So that's number 6. So that's a overall summary of these kind of 6 initial areas. We wanted to say that for COVID-19, there was an impact on our work. We mentioned the 6 initial program areas, but there were very immediate things that we had to shift towards doing during COVID-19 impacts. During COVID-19, we created a rent relief program, which at the time was one of the largest of its kind in terms of the city's funding contribution. We had implemented a housing and eviction help center to help tenants. We were coordinating with the county to figure out ways of how to stabilize tenants who are in vulnerable situations. And then we also applied for and received funding for 2 homeless prevention projects under the state's Project Home Key program. One is the Life Moves Mountain View project, and another one that we're working on right now is the Crestview Hotel project. Next slide, please. In addition, we are working on other housing items as well. Some we've accomplished and kind of completed, and some are still works in progress and are ongoing. So we have been still evaluating how we can create a program to acquire and preserve existing rental units. We have been implementing new state law for replacement requirements and for other provisions that may be under, for example, the density bonus program. The density bonus program under the state also has replacement requirements, and we were looking at those as well. We've helped finance over 500 new affordable housing units in the city, and we have an active pipeline of new affordable housing projects that we will be working on over the next 5 years. We have been implementing an updated below market rate affordable housing program, and that pipeline is much greater than we have had in the past. And we have a lot of units in the BMR program right now. So that's a great thing. The council approved and adopted a mobile home rent stabilization ordinance as well. And we were also able to apply for and receive a breakthrough challenge grant. The Breakthrough Challenge Grant is something to help cities advance housing policies and programs, including displacement response. And just a quick note that this grant was made possible by the Partnership for the Bay's Future, and awarded cities receive a fellow to help us with the work. And we are required to partner with housing organizations. Our partners are SB at Home and Housing Trust Silicon Valley, our formal community partners, and we thank them for their collaboration, but we certainly see all of you as partners in this process as well. One final note, in terms of background, some other factors shaping our displacement response. Some of you may know that last year in August, we held an affordable housing study session to talk about how we might produce and finance more new affordable housing. But we also talked about displacement response. And during that meeting, we identified a couple of areas that were shorter term in nature, and which is focusing on the funding and how to put together an acquisition preservation program. It's really key to be able to have funding for such a program. So that's a very important priority for us. We also noted that there are these things called Opportunity to Purchase Act programs. Michaela will talk a little bit more about those later in this presentation, and also other opportunities to be able to make acquisition preservation work, such as these organizations called community land trusts. And again, Michaela will talk about that later. We talked about seeking funding partners, which is really key. And also developing local replacement requirements was another area that was identified in the study session in August. Some of you may also know that cities across California are undergoing a housing element update process. This is a process that's required by the state, and cities have to identify ways of meeting affordable housing needs in different income levels. But cities must also identify various programs to address their needs. And so in our housing element update, displacement response was added as a program to our draft housing element. So that is also guiding our work. And finally, the city priorities. The city has a community for all and intentional housing options as part of our top strategic priorities. And so displacement response is really a way to respond to those priorities. The city also has what's called a race equity and inclusion initiative. So what we are developing here through displacement response will be also viewed through the city's race equity and inclusion initiative. So definitely wanted to mention these pieces. So we wanted to just sort of summarize the overall timeline. The process started back in 2019. We started some initial good work on this, and then we had to really focus on pandemic response. Through pandemic response, we were able to create new programs. We were able to identify potential areas that may add on our 6 initial program areas. Today, we're starting the first in a series of community meetings, and we will have more over the next few weeks. And then we are planning to go back to council sometime before the end of this fiscal year, which would conclude in Q2 of this year, so in the next few months or so. So we will put this information up on the website once we have a firm date on this. But because a lot have changed and we've been doing a lot of work and we are doing these community input meetings, we wanted to bring this information back again to council. Our goal after the next study session, though, is to really start to put programs into place and to implement more programs. Finally, on the next slide, here's the big picture summary of the challenge and the opportunity. So residents are displaced when redevelopment happens in various situations. And we anticipate that redevelopment will continue to happen. So the goal is to be able to support new housing development, that's important, but also to support residents staying in their existing units and or in the city, and also achieving the city's different sets of important values, such as inclusivity, diversity, housing affordability, availability and accessibility, equity, and fair housing. And so we have some opportunities here to create policies and programs to prevent, to mitigate, or to respond to displacement, so we can keep existing residents in Mountain View. So now I'm going to take a second here and turn this over to Michaela, who will be talking about the next phase of developing the displacement response strategy and some thoughts we're currently envisioning as some key focus areas going forward. We'll be incorporating your input into our analysis, along with legal, planning, economic, and equity analysis, which will guide the types of information we will be bringing back to council for consideration. So with that, I'd like to transition this over to Michaela.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you all for joining us tonight to start this conversation with us. I'll start by having us dig into some of the policies and programs that we've been talking about. On the screen, you'll see a bunch of programs that the city currently implements, but we might have opportunity for improvement upon, as well as potential programs that we haven't yet implemented that we are considering and we might want to implement. This is not an exhaustive list, and we are hoping by the end of this multi-month outreach experience that we will get input on other options that we should be considering. So I'll just go through this chart column by column. The first column here is prevention, which is where a resident would never be displaced to begin with. They would stay in their existing unit. And the city has some current programs. We have a just cause eviction protection program. We have rent stabilization. We have rental assistance programs, and we have our housing and eviction help center. And those are all aimed at helping residents stay in their existing units and stabilizing households. We could consider some new programs, including using public funds or other sources of funds to acquire and preserve naturally affordable units, so buildings where the rent is already naturally lower than the top of the market rate. We could also consider developing opportunity to purchase programs to purchase and preserve buildings where community members or tenants would be able to be the purchasers of the buildings to preserve them in the long term. And we could develop funding and partnerships to support those programs. And we'll delve more into that in a moment. The next category is mitigation, where a household may be displaced, but they're supported in hopefully staying in Mountain View or in the immediate area. The city currently has a tenant relocation assistance ordinance, which requires that displaced households get some assistance when they're being displaced. And we are also building a significant pipeline of new affordable units, which is meant in part to keep folks in Mountain View who may not be able to afford market rate units. The city could consider putting in place preferences for displaced tenants in affordable housing, or for developing partnerships with owners of vacant units to allow for temporary relocation. And then finally, there's the other category of response, which is things that might address temporary displacement, but would ultimately result in the household being able to return to a new unit. Right now, there is a state law in place, which we'll discuss in a moment, that requires that when naturally affordable rent stabilized units are demolished, they must be replaced. And we're implementing that state law. However, we could consider doing something on the local level, not just from the state law, particularly because we know that this state law is expected to expire in about 7 years. Sorry, I realized I just put some of the screen off of your screen here. Let me fix that. The city could also consider options to make the first right of refusal, which is another element of that state law in which displaced tenants get the first chance at an affordable unit in a redeveloped property, more feasible in cases where rental units get replaced with ownership units. We also can consider modifications to our tenant relocation assistance ordinance or other pieces of our existing policy. So that's a lot. And we will hopefully delve into them all over the coming months, but we do have 4 areas of focus where we would really love community input, namely replacement requirements, preservation and acquisition programs, opportunity to purchase programs, and other places where we might be missing some important gaps that we could fill to address some of these issues. I'm going to go into more depth of each of these in the next slides. The first category is replacement requirements. In short, replacement requirements require that demolished rent-stabilized units be replaced in some way. There is currently a state law that requires that rent-stabilized units be replaced with deed-restricted affordable units based on the former tenant's income. This law is called SB 330, and it currently is expected to expire in 2030. There's also the allowance in state law for cities to implement something where demolished rent-stabilized units be replaced with new rent-stabilized units. This is allowed by the Ellis Act, and that's something that we could consider putting in place locally. So as we consider replacement requirements, we have a lot of questions, but here are some key ones that we hope to delve into with all of you over the next 2 months. They include, if you were displaced, would you want to return to a replacement unit? And if that happened, where would you stay in the meantime? And for property owners, what kinds of affordable units can you feasibly include in your redevelopment? The next program that we'd like to discuss is using public or other funding sources to support purchasing naturally affordable developments, such as older rent-stabilized buildings, to preserve them as affordable for the long term. The city is currently looking for funding partners to pursue this, but we haven't yet developed a partnership that would make this happen. But we have developed other funding partnerships for some of our affordable housing work, and we're hoping to use that as a model. We're also monitoring regional ballot measures that may provide potential affordable housing funding that would support a preservation and acquisition program. So as we consider this program, we also have some more key questions to delve into with all of you. One of the questions is, are there such buildings going to be going up for sale in the coming years? We'd love to hear from property owners about their plans in the coming years. Which kinds of properties would be the best fit for these funding opportunities that we are already exploring? And for households living in these properties, are they comfortable with their properties converting to public ownership, which will likely come with some new income requirements, but also come with some certainty regarding the property's continued existence. Another program that has come up is opportunity to purchase programs, which goes in hand in hand with acquisition preservation, because the end result is that naturally affordable buildings are acquired and preserved. But in this effort, the way it works is that before a property owner sells a property, they must publicly notice a sale for some fixed period of time. And that notification period is meant to allow community-led groups, such as tenants or nonprofits, to make an offer to purchase the property at a market rate sales price. The city is currently studying other cities that have opportunity to purchase programs to understand the applicability of the programs to Mountain View and the process. And we know that we would have to find funding to support these purchases, just as I described in the last slide. Some of the key questions that we'd like to consider with all of you in the coming weeks are there tenant groups or nonprofit groups that are interested in this opportunity to purchase act kind of program? What do property owners need if they want to sell their properties in a way that is successful and quick for them? And does this reflect a current issue that we see in Mountain View? Are there a lot of off-market sales happening that prevents the participation of potential tenant groups or nonprofit groups from having the opportunity to make an offer for these properties? And finally, we'd like to look at some other areas, some of which we've identified and some of which we hope you will identify for us in the coming months. This isn't an exhaustive list of ideas that we have, but a couple of examples are looking at our existing tenant relocation assistance ordinance and potentially modifying it to increase the amount of financial assistance available, or maybe some other modifications that are needed. Another one is looking at the replacement requirements that the state law has regarding replacing demolished rental units with ownership units and finding ways to make it possible for the displaced tenants to actually live in those ownership units. And the key questions that come with this are, what are some of the current gaps and successes of our existing tenant relocation assistance ordinance? We'd really love to hear from folks who've actually received funds from that assistance ordinance and get a firsthand perspective on what works and what doesn't. We'd also love to hear from about households who may be displaced about whether they would want to pursue ownership if their unit was replaced with an ownership unit. And if they didn't want to, are there nonprofit land trust partners that could step in and purchase the units as ownership units and then rent them back to the displaced tenants? And probably other items that we haven't had a chance to bring up today, or that you all haven't, that you all will bring up to us in the coming months. So we know this is a lot of information for just the first night, and that's why this is a multi-phase outreach effort, and we have several stakeholder meetings that we hope to have, where we will be asking for your input and for your discussion. So these are listed here. We hope that you will participate in any meeting that applies for you. Just to give a rundown, we have a meeting scheduled for property owners next Wednesday, a meeting scheduled for nonprofit developers also next Wednesday, a meeting scheduled for market rate developers next Thursday, 2 tenant meetings, one on January 25th, that one will be virtual, and another one on January 26th. That one will be in person at the Mountain View Community Center. And there will be childcare available, as well as light dinner and refreshments available. And finally, we have a summary meeting where we hope to make sure we've captured all the information you shared on Tuesday, February 21st. And then we'll have our council study session in the second quarter of this year. We also would really love the opportunity to speak to folks either one-on-one or with small groups meetings. And we can have those meetings in any language that you'd like. We just need a little bit of time to set those up. But if you would like to set up one of those meetings, please contact Displacement Response at mountainview.gov, or just send any questions you have, and we would love to set up a further conversation with you. If you have a personal story about an experience you had, we'd love to hear it. If you have a group that would like to talk to us, we'd love to talk. And all of this information is also at our website, mountainview.gov/displacement response. So just to get the conversation started, I would like to start by asking a couple questions of the group. And again, tonight is just the start of our conversation. We'll have much more time to get into all of these questions later. So, and there was a question in the chat already. Will there be interpretation available for the in-person meeting? Yes, there will. And also for the virtual tenant meeting, there will be interpretation available. Thanks for asking. So I have this question for folks, and I'm going to ask that folks either raise their hand to answer or put their answer in the chat. Or if you are using a phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. And we're going to be trying to get to as many folks as possible, but we will have a little bit less time for feedback today, and we'll have much more time in the upcoming sessions. But let's start with this. So here's the question again. And I see that we already have a couple of raised hands, so just give me one moment. I'm going to invite Janet to speak and share her thoughts. So the question is, if there is displacement, what outcomes would you like to see for tenants? Janet, if you can unmute. All right, Janet, if you have a chance to unmute, feel free to go ahead. Okay, we'll come back to Janet. I'm going to ask Tim to share his thought.
Hi, Tim McKenzie. I'm in the Montaloma neighborhood. I've been here since about 2015. Well, ideally, we would not see displacement, but if it were to occur, tenants would be able to move somewhere that doesn't disrupt their roots in a potential neighborhood, and move somewhere that is at a similar or perhaps even better level of affordability, because housing costs are a bit crazy. And I'd like to see something like a community land trust, where it's housing not run for profit, but made just so people can maintain a stable housing situation, and just as a local model that we could think about and look towards. I know that the professors on Stanford's campus have almost something of a community land trust model, where professors can like buy a house on campus, but it's a however long lease, and they aren't able to sell it for profit at the end. They're just able to have a stable housing situation throughout their life, have their connections with the community, and then it transfers over to someone else that comes through and lives in the community. So maintaining connections within the community, ideally things like being able to maintain schools, maintain like your local physician or dentist or things like that, and having affordable housing that people are able to move into.
Thank you, Tim. That's exactly the kind of feedback that we are trying to capture here. So I really appreciate that. I see in the chat, we have a comment from Julie Solomon that says, I would like to see tenants have safe, affordable, and accessible replacement housing in Mountain View if they would like to stay in Mountain View. And I would also like any school-age children to have the opportunity to remain in the same school. So that's a really helpful nuance. Nancy, I see that we have something in the chat in Spanish. If you could translate that for the group. I think you're muted, Nancy.
Sí, creo que alguien estaba traduciendo lo que ya habían dicho, que puedan seguir viviendo en la ciudad, si se puede, que sean dueños de sus hogares con apoyo de algún programa. La opción de un fideicomiso es muy buena. Apoyamos esa idea. It says that yes, we are living in the we want them to keep living in the city. That how the second it moves. They want they can stay in the city. Yes, that they can be owners of their home with some support of a program, and that the idea of the land land trust is a good idea. We support that idea.
And I see there's another comment in Spanish. Nancy, can you take a moment to translate that one as well?
Let me see. Where is it? Oh, the city acts fast and on time. We don't want more families to suffer this displacement.
Thank you. I see another raised hand from Kevin. I'm going to allow him to talk. Kevin, feel free to unmute yourself.
I did. Thank you, Michaela. My name is Kevin Ma. I'm a resident in the San Antonio neighborhood. Again, as a previous speaker has mentioned, obviously the goal should be to reduce displacement as much as possible, because it's inherently chaotic for that family to be able to need to find another place in such a high cost environment as ours. Inherently, I would like to see, like, obviously a smooth transition from the person to their new location. This may mean, you know, a bit of relief in terms of funding, because inherently there's probably going to be a jump in rent, unfortunately, because of the market. But it should be simple to the tenant. It should not be basically letting them off into the wild. And this may mean, a period of time in, a city block of housing in order to make SB 330's right of return actually a right of return rather than kind of a dream. Yeah, that's my statement.
Thank you, Kevin. I see we have a couple more comments here in the chat. One person said that they'd like help in finding affordable housing in Mountain View and not be displaced from their hometown. Rent has gone up, and since rent has gone up, a lot of minorities have moved, and some of whom have lived in Mountain View for over 22 years. And B says, in the mobile home community to prevent displacement, we've had discussions about COPA. That's the acronym for Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, one of the opportunity to purchase programs that I mentioned earlier, so that we could develop a resident-owned community. I see another comment here in Spanish. Nancy, if you could take that one.
Okay, yes. I don't want more displacements, but if this happen, I would like for these people find help in finding another housing that is safe and close to Mountain View, so the children can continue assisting to the school, and the family don't have to face so much stress around this issue.
I think one thing I've heard a couple of times tonight is an interest in making sure kids can maintain continuity in their schools. So that's a helpful nuance that I don't think I've heard in these meetings previously. So thank you. I see Anna Marie has her hand raised. I'm gonna allow her to talk and ask her to unmute herself.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Awesome. I did join the meeting late, but I live in the mobile home community as well. I've been in Mountain View for over 40 years, so my entire life. My mom has been here for over 40 years. So I recently became disabled like 2 years ago. My mom is a disabled senior. If we were to be displaced, which we actually are possibly, we're in the process of trying to make sure we get financial aid for 2 months from the past. We're able to pay our rent now moving forward, but we could possibly be on the verge of being displaced. We're really hoping that this stuff happens soon, because for us, we really need our community, our neighbors, our family. If we were to have to move out of the area, I don't know how we would survive, like without all the help we have here. So that's something to think about, like the old, seniors, veterans, disabled people, families, especially with young children. This is something that I'm hoping will happen sooner rather than later. Especially displacement shouldn't happen in the first place, but there are definitely some landlords that don't care. If you had a medical emergency, they don't care about anything except for their profit. And Mountain View really needs to be aware of that and take action now. So I'm really appreciative of this, this whole meeting tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. I have another comment here in the chat. It says, ideally displaced tenants should have the option to remain in their neighborhood in units with the same level of amenities and the same or lower cost. And a new location should allow for long-term housing so folks don't have to move twice. I see another comment here from Tim that says COPA, which is the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act program that we talked about earlier, would be very important. He says, at the start of November, I got a notice that my complex was being sold and the sale was completed within 1 month. Tenants had no real opportunity to purchase. So this is answering one of the questions that I asked earlier that I'd like to delve into more if this type of thing is happening where folks don't have the opportunity to make an offer. I'd also be very strongly in favor of a local version of SB 330. That's the state law that has replacement requirements in it to ensure tenant protections continues after the state law sunsets. He also says, I recall the city council has floated the idea of a vacancy tax on businesses. I'd like to see a vacancy tax on landlords as well, so housing is not taken off the market in hopes of a greater profit. And Jacob says, I second the idea of a vacancy tax on landlords. So this is one of those ideas that we didn't have listed here tonight, but we're that's part of the reason we're asking for community feedback. So that's very helpful to get new ideas as well. I don't see a lot of other chats and raised hands, but I know there's a lot of thoughts out there. So I'm going to give folks a second, although we have time for more questions. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. And this is really the catch-all question, which is what areas should we study that we haven't brought up today? And I'll just add an addendum to this question, which is there a question that I raised earlier that we mentioned that we'd like to delve into in our smaller meetings in the next few weeks that you're really excited about and you want to chime in on today? Feel free to, this is your chance, feel free to chime in. It's not your only chance because we will have many more meetings, but feel free to chime in today. We'd like to hear from you. I do see a comment in the chat in Spanish. If you could share that,
Yes.
Nancy.
Yeah. Yes. From Garcia. What happened with the family that decide to live in an RV so their children can continue going to school? If the people don't have an income to rent in the city, how can they have the opportunity to offer or buy something BMR? It's still expensive. I know all, and they're not all they are not receive benefits.
Thanks, and I think that's a good point that, you know, the people who are displaced have a really wide range of needs. Some people are able to pay rent, and some people really have much lower incomes and wouldn't be able to pay rent in these situations. And we need to find solutions for all those different groups. So thank you. That's a
Michaela, but basically they're saying for the people that are living in RVs and for the people that don't have enough income, how they can afford to offer to buy. That's what, yeah, I'm just repeating myself.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great question. I'm not going to try to answer it today because I think that's the point of this conversation, but I think it's very clear that we're going to need options for people who don't have income and can't pay rent even at a modest level. So I think that's where our affordable housing might come in. We have some affordable housing programs for people who are extremely low income and can't pay rent, but it's clear we don't have enough to meet the needs. So I think this is a really important part of the conversation. Thank you for raising it.
Michaela, could I just add one sort of preview for folks is that some of, I think what that question is touching on is sort of the concept of first right of refusal. So there's some ways where we're trying to be able to have folks actually be able to connect to the new housing opportunity. So we'll be able to talk more about those, I think, in more detail in the stakeholder meetings. But regarding the financial piece of making the new homes actually accessible to the tenants is a very important area of work that we're trying to think about. And so that will be under both our displacement response strategy as well as our overall affordable housing strategy that we want to put in place. And that will require probably some partnerships and maybe some folks to assist with, say, down payment assistance programs or other kind of financial support. So that is on our list, but we appreciate that you brought that up because it is an important area that may not seem as big as creating new housing units, but it's very important for the families and for the tenants who want to make the new housing a reality. So thank you.
And I do see a clarification from the Day Worker Center that says specifically for residents in vehicles, they have this question. And I'll just share, we'd love to meet, if there's folks who are living in vehicles or who know folks who are living in vehicles, we'd love to meet to hear more about the specific needs of those households. Some members of my team did go out to the two of the safe parking lots earlier this year to interview folks to understand what their income levels are, what their housing needs are, where they've tried to find housing and what barriers they've faced, because we know that those barriers are pretty significant. And if we want to prevent displacement, we want those folks to be able to find housing in Mountain View. So we'd love to continue to do that work. We are currently, when we build new affordable housing, I actually refer to those interviews when I tell new affordable housing developers, we have to have units to meet these people's needs because they're telling us their needs aren't being met. So the feedback is really critical. So if there's more opportunities to have that kind of feedback, we'd love to set up meetings with small groups to hear that. I see another comment in the chat that says support for co-ops and another comment that says rent control. I don't know if you want to chime in more on that one. I see another hand raised from Philip. I'm going to ask him to talk.
Right. I mean, someone mentioned the family in the RV with children. As I recall, this family was displaced from their rent-controlled apartment. But when they went out to buy to run another apartment, it was at market rent, and they couldn't afford that. So they took what they could afford and moved into an RV. So you can be paying much lower rent in your rent-controlled apartment. And if you lose that due to demolition, what's going to be available, even if it's a rent-controlled apartment, is going to be much more expensive.
Thanks, Philip. I think that brings up an important issue. If we replace rent-controlled units with rent-controlled units, but they come back at market rate to begin with, that will exclude a lot of folks from being able to return to them. So I think that's an important nuance that we're needing to look at. Other comments or hand raising, and feel free to just, anything that comes to mind. I know we brought up a lot of issues today, and we'd like to make sure we raise stuff so that we can continue to follow up on them in the coming meetings. I see another comment that says, if landlords do not have the money to upgrade dilapidated units, does the city have allocated funds to help landlords bring units into a livable condition? So that's a great question. It's not something the city currently has a program for, but I know it's come up. So I'm thankful that you brought up another new idea for us to put on the list here. So thank you very much. That's very helpful. I see a hand raised from B. I'm going to ask her to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I have a reaction to the question about what we haven't brought up. Since you're going to be having meetings with property owners, perhaps you can explore the idea of what they would want if the mobile home parks, which are extremely profitable, two of them are extremely profitable because they have rental units, would they be willing to sell or to the existing mobile homeowners who are space tenants but not rental tenants? And if so, or could a community land trust be arranged to do that to support the mobile homeowners?
And when you say owners, you mean people who would own the particular units?
Yes. So there are two classes of tenants in the mobile home parks. There are people who rent, like Anna Marie. She's actually having to pay close to, I think, market rate rent. So right beside the market rate rent, which includes base rent, are the majority, which are mobile homeowners. I'm having a little hard time expressing myself tonight. Sorry.
No,
So,
totally clear. That's helpful.
So the two classes are renters and homeowners.
Mm-hmm.
And in Santiago Villa Mite Park, 25% of the park units are rentals, and they are rented out at market rates. So the park owner is making an awful lot of money off of this park. And I'm wondering if, since he hates rent control, and he's made it very clear that he hates rent control, would it mollify him to get rid of these units by selling them to the existing homeowners? Or could a community land trust come in and
convenient to have couple?
So I think you got the idea. I hope that's clear, but I'm not sure it is.
I got it. Thank you, B. And I do want to remind folks, we don't need to necessarily assume other people's intentions, but I appreciate the feedback. That's very helpful. I see some more comments in the chat. One person said, if the city provides money to property owners to help upgrade their property, should the city get a stake in that property? And then I saw a response to that said, I like the idea of the city gaining equity for providing funds for upgrades. City doesn't need to be a landlord. It could transfer to a nonprofit community land trust. I see some comments here in Spanish. Nancy, if you don't mind helping us translate them. I think the first is from Marco.
Okay, Marcos says that for tenants, it will be nice to have, it will be convenient to have COPA, since it will give preference to tenants to buy a property before the owners offer it to the market for other buyers. And then he asked you, could you please explain more in detail how COPA works?
Thanks, that's a great question. And quite honestly, we're still studying different ways that a COPA program might work, and we could delve into it further. So I don't want to come with any preconceived notions, but the general idea is that if a property owner wants to sell their property, before they sell their property, they have to provide notice if they'd like to do so. And they provide the notice publicly and usually to a list so that the tenants or community nonprofits find out that this property is for sale. And there's a certain period of time under which the property owner would be required to allow folks to make market rate offers. And that is basically meant to allow folks who may not typically participate in the real estate market behind the scenes make offers and compete on the market with everybody else to purchase a property. Typically, these programs do not require the owner to sell it to any particular person, but it does require the opportunity for all players to participate in the market, typically. But there's a lot of nuances to these programs, and it's not one size fits all. And so I think one thing we'd like to hear is if such a program were to be considered in Mountain View, what would make sense particularly for our city? I see we have another comment in Spanish from Chayito.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see. I don't see it. Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. I am trying to, okay. Hold a second. I'm trying to see it. Okay, Chayito. This type of project, if becomes a reality, se logra ayuda de how much time will take to do this? I just received 2 phone calls asking for information if we continue with the house rent and also with rent for BMR. The first person mentioned that she has a few hours of work because it's the beginning of the year. She works in a store. The other person mentioned that his wife is pregnant and they live in and they need to live here because of his job. He would like to live alone with his partner, spouse, because he shares his housing with many people. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to make sure that folks know, this is a long-term strategy that we're working on. I think several people tonight have mentioned that this is urgent, but I do want to, set the stage to know that while we will work with all due haste, there's not going to be solutions that we come up with tomorrow. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to stop sharing the slide for a moment and just share information about our Housing and Eviction Help Center. For folks that need immediate assistance, that's a great place to go to learn more about your rights as a tenant, to learn more about rental assistance programs, and also to learn about affordable housing opportunities in the city. So I'm sharing this website right now. This is information about the Housing and Eviction Help Center. I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint or the flyer right now. Our Housing and Eviction Help Center is available at the library on the first and third Thursdays of the month from 1 to 5. We also have availability virtually. There's translation services available in multiple languages. And if you have a question, you can always email mvrent@mountainview.gov. This has been a really great resource that started during the pandemic. Anki, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, everybody's welcome to come to the library. If you have limited availability on those Thursdays, you can always come visit our offices, email above here, and there's also a telephone number if you would like to leave a message. We have a lot of resources. It sounds a little bit far-fetched from Housing Help Center, but we also have a diaper distribution program. So there's all kinds of resources for people that need help in any area for a safe, a healthy housing environment. That's it.
Thank you, Anki. I'm going to leave this up on the screen for a few more minutes so people can copy down the information. I'm also putting it in the chat. I see another question from Cindy in Spanish. Nancy, would you mind interpreting that one?
Yes. Yes, she mentioned that I don't understand when a person goes to rent an apartment, the amount of children is part of the limit of people living in that apartment. I know a family of 6, 2 adults and 4 children, and they cannot rent an apartment of 1 or 2 room because they go beyond the limit of people allowed in this place. They have to rent a housing of 3 bedroom, which with the income of 2 people, they don't have enough money to pay for that rent. Can you do something about this?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think it raises a really big issue, which is that if you have a larger family, and it doesn't really have to be that large, it's much more difficult to afford housing in Mountain View. And so I think that's something that we have put in our housing element as a priority to address, something we've raised in the affordable housing study session with council, and we will continue to prioritize that issue. So thank you for raising it. I will say typically occupancy standards are required by various laws. So there's not a lot that we can do to address those, and they are meant for habitability, but we can do work to try to make sure that we have more opportunities for families that are bigger than just 3 or 4 folks in the family. So thank you for raising that issue. I see, are there other
Michaela, there are 2 more
here?
comments. Yeah,
Yes,
there are 2 more comments. One of them said, Maria, yes, I support COPA. And the next comment is from Angel. What kind of support can the city offer to community groups or tenants that would like to buy their own apartments?
Great question. So this is one of the issues that we raised earlier, which is, if we were to consider an opportunity to purchase act program where tenants or community groups were able to purchase things, quite clearly there would need to be funding to help support that. And so we are exploring funding partnerships to potentially support these kinds of, to support preservation activities. And there is potentially a regional ballot measure that might have funding available, but we don't have any secured funding for these types of partnerships yet. So that is the type of thing that we'd like to hear more about the interest levels out there so we can start researching that kind of funding. So sounds like there's interest, which was one of my questions. So that's helpful to understand, and thank you for raising that. I'm going to just see if we have any more raised hands. And just as a reminder for folks, if you are on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9.
Michaela, I think Janet still has her hands up. I don't know if she's still here. She wants to talk.
Yeah, she's very welcome to unmute herself if she can. Nancy, I don't know if you want to translate that just in case.
Janet, si quieres hablar, por favor, tienes que poner tu micrófono en vivo porque ahora mismo lo tienes como en silencio y por eso no puedes hablar. Ok.
Buenas noches, disculpen, no sé si se están refiriendo a mí, Janet
Sí.
Quintana. Pero sí quería hacer una pregunta, justo le estaban comunicando sobre el interés que hay de comprar propiedad acá dentro de la ciudad de Mountain View, porque muchas familias latinas están siendo movidas a otros lados y a muchos nos interesan. Pienso que una idea sería trabajar con identidades que puedan hacer préstamo a las familias para que vayan pagando como una mensualidad, como que si pagaran el alquiler de su casa propia.
Okay, hold a second, Janet. I understand that there are people that are interested in buying their own property. I wonder if there is an agency or organization that can provide some kind of loan to community so we can be paying back those loans like if they were a rent, like a rent type of payment back. Okay.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Jen. That's exactly the kind of feedback that we're looking for. Those are types of programs that we could explore together. And so it sounds like there's interest in those as well. So we will explore those. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Anything else, Janet? Janet, ¿algo más que querías decir?
No, thank you so much for help to our community, because for a couple of years we have this problem about the house. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other folks who would like to chime in either via the chat or raising their hands? We'd love to hear from you, but we know that this is not just the beginning of the conversation. So if you aren't ready to talk tonight, we'll talk to you soon.
Michaela, I may have missed it, but I think Nancy in the chat box said to make the difference between COPA and TOPA. And maybe I can just take a moment. COPA is, when people use that term COPA, it's the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. And usually when people say that, it means it's a program that's kind of geared for like nonprofit developers or like a community land trust to be able to make an offer for a property. And when people use the word TOPA, that typically refers to Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Acts. And in that case, it would be like a program that would be geared for tenants or tenant groups to be able to make an offer for property. And so they're just, they're both Opportunity to Purchase Act programs. One is geared a little bit more towards developers and nonprofits, the other geared more towards TOPA for tenants. In reality, you can have one program that has both aspects that can incorporate an opportunity for developers, nonprofit developers, or tenants in one program. So, but that's sort of a summary in terms of like, what is the difference with COPA and TOPA? It's mostly between the groups, but the main program would mostly be the same.
Thanks, Wayne. I just want to give folks a couple more minutes to chime in the chat or to raise their hands. While we do that, I'm going to just do a reminder of all the different ways that we would like to continue to chat with you in the coming weeks. So again, here is a list of all the different meetings that we have organized. They're all listed at mountainview.gov/displacement response. And I'll note that there will be interpretation services available for both of the tenant meetings, and one of them is in person. I'd also love to remind folks that if you would like to meet one-on-one or with a group that you have, we'd be really eager to set those meetings up. You can contact Displacement Response at mountainview.gov, and we can schedule a meeting. And we can schedule those meetings in multiple languages. So whatever language works for you or your group, we're happy to organize. So please just let us know and we will organize it. I do see another question here in the chat. Nancy, if you don't mind translating it.
Hay otra pregunta, déjame ver. Oh, no, everything is in English. I don't see anything on the second. Oh, okay. Oh, Angel is asking, can we have both on the city Copa and Topa at the same time?
Yep, that's a great question. There's nothing that would prevent a community from having both at the same time. So that's certainly an option if we decided to consider that route. Alex is asking in the chat, would a public bank allow the city to have more control and better long-term sustainable financing for anti-displacement projects? Possibly. That's another idea we haven't had a chance to talk about tonight. So thanks for bringing it up. Okay, well, with that, I think I'm going to get ready to close the meeting tonight. Thank you all so much for participating. We've already gotten a lot of really good nuances as to areas of focus that we should be considering, places where there is significant community interest, and things that we haven't had a chance to really delve into that we should. And I'm really hoping that we'll continue to hear from you in the coming months. And that when we meet on February 21st, we'll be able to reflect back to you how we are integrating your feedback into our work. It's been really, really helpful. We're capturing everything you've shared. And please also, we're so happy to hear from you, but we'd love to also hear from people you know. So if everybody could take a moment in the next couple of days to tell someone else that you know in the city about these conversations and invite them to participate, I think the more folks that we hear from, the better this will turn out. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate your participation. Extra big thanks to our interpreters, Nancy, Ivy, Eileen, and Anna. That's been extremely helpful for you to share your skills with us tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Buenas noches.